So I'll begin by, I studied in the UK, and I studied a degree. I wanted to get into fine art, but the university I applied to thought that fine art was painting, and I didn't really want to be a painter. And so they suggested I went to the textile department, which was in about 1973. And so experimental art and so on was, very much on the beginning to be on the table. And I got accepted into this, into an honours degree course. First time that honours degrees were being offered in the UK. And it was a wonderful thing. It was hard in some ways to end up with a degree in textiles when you're a man, and people don't recognise the sheer impact that textiles has had. But so that's my first kind of vague introduction to technology, because weaving and all those sorts of activities were very much part of a kind of coded process that would lead me on. So that's a sort of process of where I started and went in 1977, Jubilee year, by the way. I left to go to Australia, and this was a very strange transition for me to go to this place where things, a historian called Paul Carter suggested an idea about the emptiness of resemblance. Everything was like England, all the laws and everything else and so on, but it had a strange emptiness to that, because things looked the same but weren't the same. People talked the same language, drove on the same side of the road, all the rules were the same. It's like you got on and were teleported somewhere. And so this, with my fascination of space, because I come from Lincolnshire originally, and it's the flatlands, the fenlands, so I love distant horizons as an aesthetic thing. And so being confronted with this, I started to do a lot of performative documentary work about space. And I produced the documents because I was in the most isolated city in the world, and I could then post my artwork out, because nobody was going to give me an exhibition of me holding a piece of string and looking at it as a sort of analogy to relocating to a new environment and trying to draw some creative inspiration from what I was perceiving. So this led me on then, and to keep in mind the isolation, to a number of different ideas about how technology was starting to evolve a collapse in space. In other words, network technologies were coming online, and in 1983 an artist came to Perth who brought their typewriter with them, and we're sitting here looking at this typewriter, and then he gets the telephone, dials a number, and then puts it into the typewriter, and suddenly the typewriter sprung into life and connected him via the phone line to Canada, to IP Sharp. And IP Sharp were offering artists a kind of network that they could communicate on called Artex. And so this was instrumental, let's say, in like the feeling of being connected when you're so isolated from anything, that here was an instant, and you could type in various things. They'd go to a telex, and then they would start to develop, and people like Roy Ascot would develop projects around this, the pleasure of the text and so on, where people would all get together, and this whole beginning of a kind of global consciousness developed by the possibilities of new media seemed to come into it. So fax machines, all this sort of ability to speak beyond your physical, to touch at a distance type of thing. And this became a fascinating idea for me, as when you're like in an isolated city, and it is a long way to drive to the other side of the continent, you sometimes become quite introverted, you know, in the safety of that environment. And I think that introversion is really an interesting thing, because you become very reflective on yourself in relationship to the technologies that you're starting to use. And then in the 80s, the beginning of the 80s, I was instrumental in starting this group called Media Space, and we were exploring things to do with ideas of where we lived, of our environment and our environment. And of course, this guy coming in 2003 was part of that group. But I started to do more interactive work because I just got my first laptop computer, well, desktop computer. And this desktop computer enabled me to not only sort of come to terms with some of my dyslexia of not being able to write and spell and so on, because for the first time this kind of thinking machine would see that I'd spelt a word wrong and correct it, and gave me a little bit more confidence in engaging in the world because of this technological. And so I started to do projects using the technology and using disks and networking, and trying to send a series of disks to people on the Artex network, like the 1.4 meg, you know, little disk that you used to put in the Mac, and ask them to interact with the artwork on it and then send it back to me. And then I built up this whole sort of relationship with technology that moved along relative to my interest in spatial awareness. And this spatial awareness sort of grew as I started to say, well, I should do my master's. And I started to do it on verandas, like the strange space of a veranda, like the private of the house, social space outside, and this strange zone between the two, which is really uncomfortable. Like when I first got to Australia, I hated being on verandas. Like I hate being seen, and I hate seeing people from it. You know, like it's an inverse thing. And so I became very fascinated by that. And that space I started to use and photograph, and then start to build a CD-ROM about this fascination with comparisons and interpreting the veranda space as a abstract fetishized space, because nobody seems to know what to do with it. They throw a chair there, or they have a beer can, or you know, and things, or like by the side of the chair, or they have a milk crate upside down for somebody to sit on. And yet the inside and the outside, and there's this sort of strange how people present themselves to the world is on the veranda. So I started to do all this analysis of this, made the CD-ROM, moved on to the space through interest in perspectivalized space and the way that it tends to try and measure a very abstract form. I started to become interested in the space in between buildings, and I would video them and document them and so on. So these strange little liminal spaces between things that get left out. So somebody will paint a building one colour, you know, and then they'll paint the next building, they'll paint it a different colour, and that's fine. Or they'll do something completely different. And there's no kind of understanding of this sort of, how can I explain? It's like when you put together a sentence, and just then I paused, like I was thinking about something. And so the streets are like that. They're a series of words, and they have pauses in between them. And these pauses give effect, and they're not neutral, and they're not. So there's something about that sort of gap that meant something. This sort of strange, and so my initial space of holding out my hands and looking at it sort of got reduced down to looking at these verandas, and then turning the verandas on their side, maybe this gap between buildings. And then I started to become interested in the space between my skin and my clothes, you know, like an internal space. So when you're sitting there in your clothes now, and there's sort of, they crease and fold, and there's some of it touches your skin, and how to be aware of where every part touches your skin and where the other. And so by taking one of those, you know, medical cameras that you put down, you know, I could start to see, like by putting one in between my clothes, I started to become aware of these kind of residual strange spaces that we all live with, you know, every day, these sort of elbow spaces and shoulder spaces. So I made a long video, well, not a long video, it was actually a long, in physical terms, video of this journey between through my body. But of course I was interested in where the skin touched, and I was always fascinated by the Italian futurist and Boccioni and his relationship to Henry Bergson, and so I started to investigate that, kind of how much of us become part of the world around us. You know, like the futurist said, when you're on an omnibus, you become part of the bus, that becomes part of the street, that becomes part, it's all part of a boundarylessness of you. And so I started to make friends with the people at Symbiotica, which was a biological art group that had just started up. And so I decided that I wanted to try and do is grow some skin cells onto gold, and to see how much of us become part of the gold that we touch. And it's a very naive kind of idea, and I went there, and you know, it's just, there's a physicality to growing skin cells, like you have to do all these things and you have to use all these pipettes, and you know, and it's not like and it's like a material thing, so it's going back to sort of matter and materiality as opposed to pure data and so on. So anyway, I took these samples to atomic force microscope, which is a very fascinating thing because it doesn't use optics, it uses touch, like it continually touching the surface to get an image of that surface. And I had no idea of the scale. You know, I thought, oh, should be able to do it, but to the AFM, a skin cell was like a mountain range. You know, it was like huge. It was, and so I hit a stumbling block in this sort of investigation of this space between the skin and the object that you touch. And so I was in my first time in Ars Electronica, not in it, but going to it. I went to see one of the physicists who was using AFM and skin, and he suggested that the cantilever that touches, that I turn that to gold. And I was using gold because of the Midas touch, you know, when King Midas turned everything to gold, and when he touched it, asked for it for the gods, and the gods gave him the gift. But then he couldn't hug his kids, he couldn't eat hamburgers, you know, like he was really not, it's not a pleasant thing. And so what was once a thought became a curse. And this also fits in with like nanotechnology and nano research. There was a lot of talk at the same time about grey goo, where if you broke the bonds that hold the us together, then we would all turn into this sort of grey mush. So I was doing that, and then eventually I developed this work called Midas, where a colleague of mine wrote, named Kevin Ratsworthy, wrote a really beautiful kind of script, where when you touched the cast of the skin cell, when you touched it, which was 9-carat gold, then that touch would then, on a big screen, would send a little bloom of that would be like you were polluting the image. And so this algorithm would convert the red, green and blue of the image into gold. So it would gradually grow and grow, and the more people touched it, the more these blooms would grow. And then, so you're trying to sort of show like a responsibility of touch, or a different concept of touch in relationship to how you become part of this world, but also how you influence that world. And then, of course, this led me on to following these sorts of questions of space, and I became interested in within this realm where life existed, so at a nano level. So it does, you have a cell, but when you have a cell, which is where a lot of biology stops, and then you go further into it, so they're all atoms. So are atoms, do they have a consciousness? Are they living? So if I was to do something, how could I express this? Because I wrote a paper about God being the first nano-assembler, because he made Adam out of dust, which is metaphorically an atomistic thing. And so this was carried on through this journey into a sort of spatial awareness of the space between life and death. So I grew some immortal cell line called a Hackett cell onto, so it was confluent on top of to create a sample for the AFM. So you grow the sample, and then I put it in one of these containers so I could rush it to the atomic force microscope and in vitro scan the skin cell. And once you open it up, even in the fluid, and touch it with something else, you obviously pollute the thing and it starts to die. So I'm watching these scans, and each scan takes 20 minutes, and then the scans, when we took them as individual scans, we laid them into like a pastry, like phyllo pastry in between these layers. And my colleague worked with me to help make it so we could fly into them. And then, but using breath, because when God made, he was just a useless lump of man that didn't do anything, which we won't go into that. But to make the person alive, he had to breathe. So breath became breathe into the nose, and so breath becomes, which sort of suggested that life can't be grown, it has to be transmitted. So this notion of transmission. So I would build a little interface where you'd blow onto this, and then you would fly into this in between life and death. The top layer skin cell was living, and the bottom one was death. And then it would, you would start to develop this. I can't remember the name. So there would be, you would create a growth within that environment where you landed, and if you kept breathing, these would start to spin, and it would start to develop like a tree-like shape, but not necessarily going up. And so you're developing a kind of organism. But once you stop breathing, then of course on it, then the organism would fade away. So again, a kind of responsibility of this, of the person doing it, to think about this notion between life and death. And of course I needed to get the sound, so I recorded the sound of the AFM touching the skin cells, so the vibration of atoms were being recorded, and then I injected ether into the dish, the petri dish, so it killed the cells straight away. So you got the sound of the live and then the dead. And this sort of went on, and then I became fascinated in a kind of space between the classical world and the quantum world, because once you get down to that, you get to the submolecular, and the submolecular deals with quantum phenomena, not classical phenomena. And this took me to try and talk about consciousness, and whether using phosphorus to work as an element in the quantum computer, and we have phosphorus in our brains, then could our brains be quantum, and could we be not having to spend all this money developing a quantum computer, but to untap the sort of the potential in our own brains. And so I developed this word, quantum consciousness, that worked off the data from the superposition of an electron, and this was then visualized. And I was much more interested in the, again, like creating a visual experience than necessarily saying, I mean, you put it in quantum in the title and you think, should I put quantum in the title or not? Because but it's just to identify it within a kind of area of research, but without giving any more information away, because what you're trying to do is create a visual expression, like with the Midas and so on, and with the nanoessence, you're trying to create a beautiful visual expression of this idea that you have about space. And so I think that this led me on to working with, you know, ideas from Richard Feynman's lectures on light and mirrors, and which led me into a multiverse type of concept that he had. You know, that once you make a decision, you split into two, and this using some of his experiments, we developed a work where you stand in front of a monitor and there's two monitors inside it, and it shows you the shortest angle of incidence of your photons. So you use a photon as analogous to your head, and so there's lots of photons hitting, and when they're all in a straight, then you see this head upright. But the photons are spinning when they're not spinning, but they use the word spin, but they don't really mean spin. So they're spinning, not spinning, at an incredible rate, but they're also hitting the mirror all the way along the surface. The ones you see are the ones that are the shortest angle of incidence to what you're looking at. So I got interested in, like, all my images, let's say, of me now, or you now, are bouncing off all these walls, and they're going everywhere, and they're not being recorded because they're not, you know, in direct line of sight. They're not going straight to you, or they're not part of a mirror surface. So I thought, what it'd be like if you had a really long mirror, and they could see all the way along, and you could see the photons of your. And suddenly we realised that at certain points along this mirror, your head would reappear. And so it was suddenly mystically that the head would reappear, and I started to think of whether they were reappearing in an alternative world. You know, there's this sort of. And so that led me down that whole path, and I started to then become interested in quantum chaos, because it's such a beautiful idea that there's two forms of chaos. You know, if one form's not bad enough, then you have a second one, which is quantum chaos, which doesn't obey the same rules as classical chaos. And so by trying to turn a work into this liminal space between the classical and the quantum world, you're trying to tap into something that gives you a real understanding and an idea of how complex this understanding of this phenomena is, and how often science doesn't tell us anything about the phenomena. They tell us about the effects of the phenomena on measuring things and so on, and the inability to measure, and they don't really realize how much what they're doing, I think sometimes, especially in the uncertainty, is very reflective in the whole of 20th century fine art, which had to, quantum came at the turn of the century in 1900s, and you know, the ideas, Heisenberg's 1927 paper on uncertainty, how influential that has been in the thinking and fear of a lot of artists during that time, and trying to express or visualize the invisible, ineffable nature of things that we can't see, like trying to express emotions and so on. You know, they're things that, well, how do you do it if you can't see? So this became part of that process, and I started to write fictional books and also write books about nano art and quantum art, and just deal with some of the notions of language, like, you've got effects like quantum mirroring, quantum scarring. They're all strange titles that they give these effects of things that are not what they say they are, but they give an idea of it. And this has sort of led me right back to a kind of analog work where I've been doing drawings that try to explore this notion of a glimpse into that world, as opposed to a visualization as though there's a kind of mist and you're just trying to make something out within the mist, but you can't quite determine what it is. And so in trying to do this, I did all these drawings of things in motion, like movies. So draw a movie like, let's say, like Metropolis, which is interesting because it was also 1927, the same time as Heisenberg's paper. So there's these nice strange connections, and you draw the whole movie on one, which is something I used to teach. I used to use it as a drawing prop, like, I'll draw this film, because it's more like an assemblage of life than the still life. It's still, it's not moving in the sense of the screen stays where it is and everything just flickers on the surface. So I started drawing these and then trying to deal with the preconceptions that you have as an artist when you're drawing, and the way that you hold the pencil, or the way the hand automatically draws like that. So there's so many sort of inferences or things where you're allowing the body to have it, but then there's things that you say, ooh, I like that bit, and then you don't want to destroy that bit, and so suddenly the drawing owns you and you don't own the drawing. So you have to fight back and say, I'm just going to destroy that bit, I'm going to erase it, because it's not trying to discover a truth, even though the truth you're trying to discover can't be discovered. It's the beauty of trying to find it that's the thing. And so I did all these drawings and ended up with without really having this like clear glimpse that I wanted to have of something else. And I had a book that a friend had given me and to read, because he thought it would be interesting, and I never read books like that. But this particular book I was going to give back to him, and I felt embarrassed that I was going to give him a book back that he gave me, and I had it for a year and I hadn't even read it. So I started to read it, and it was like, I'm about page 27 of the book, it was like, this is what I've been doing in my drawing. So it was like, rather than having a problem and doing a drawing and understanding something about it, it's like doing the drawing so you could understand what this person was saying about Boltzmann's blur. And it's a whole narrative about that Carlo Rovelli wrote about Boltzmann's blur. And it was just like, oh my God, this is so much like what I'm trying to do, this notion of the blur and this sort of... And so he sort of... so you and I now, they're clear and your camera's doing HD, but what he's roughly saying is that this event that we're in, which is in a different time to anybody else's events that's happening now, is a microcosm of what's going on. And so when we see this clearly HD image, it's really a blur. It's just a blur of what's actually taking place, and we need to be much more aware of that kind of overall accumulation and accretion of everything that's going on. Not that we have to know everything that's going on, but we have to be aware that it's not just you. It's like you're videoing this, but it's your life as well. You've had a huge life. You've done so many things. And that's all part of the same thing. That I'm doing a lot of talking and you're doing a lot of listening, but when we're on a table on the floor and we've got all this technology which used to be really huge and now it's tiny. I mean, they're all things that you can try and experience. Not that you can necessarily in a classical brain deal with all of them, but they're all there, and you can allow them to sit with you and be with you and come out in some form of expression that is inherent in these things, and to trust them. So, and that's really where I'm at now, and it's hard to to put them into. So I put everything I do really online, and I've always been interested in the early romantic notion that the network was like an ether, and you put your work into the ether, and if people found it, they found it, because nobody's going to buy it in a sense of, you know, it's not a work that's necessarily sellable and so on. So maybe the drawings are, but it's not the aim. Not the aim. The aim is to discover something about myself and about the world, and to try and express it visually. Because I'm not the best writer. I try, but I'm dyslexic, and so everything gets jumbled up and messed around, and my thinking is not like, it's all over the shop. And so to write a kind of coherent argument addressing one question just seems beyond me. The question is about how I try to use the sort of technologies, and how I discover them, and how I reenact them into an artwork. And so if we started back with the Midas work, I was at the time working on a biennale that I was doing, which was trying to bring new technologies to Western Australia, and unfortunately we had a group called Symbiotica with Oran Katz and Yonat Zur, and they were actually growing skin cells, and I'd always been fascinated by, as I said before, about Boccioni's ideas, and so they enabled me to grow these skin cells, and they had an atomic force microscope at the other university that I was working at, and I asked them if they could let me have a technician who would scan these, and gradually through that process, the learning curve of having to understand how to grow a skin cell and the problems involved in that became apparent, but also the complexity of thinking about this process of, like, you suddenly realize that you can order skin cells if you're in a university to work on, because scientists have to have this whole collection of stuff that they can use, and it's their resources, but they have to know exactly what the skin cell is and where it comes from and so on and so forth, so they can identify it as that. So lots of things happen along the way, and your limited knowledge and sometimes, like, it's like when you read a philosopher, right, and so you're getting that sort of skill of understanding the whole philosophy, but the philosopher says one thing that really blows you away, and so instead of reading everything, you just go with what blew you away. So you don't have to know about what they have for breakfast and why they did what they did. You're just looking at what said and how that gets translated into you, and how it takes your breath away, what they've said. And so I'm a very not a deep researcher, so I don't do the sort of deep research. I find that there's problems along the way, and I have to learn about them. So to learn about the concepts of nano and the different notions of scale of space is unbelievable. It's so difficult to get your mind to. So I was asking a question, and I must be getting the numbers wrong, but I was asking the question of, if you had a piece of graphite, the smallest piece of graphite, like the humblest tool of an artist, the pencil, smallest piece of graphite, and you put it as though it was almost invisible, how many atoms would be in it? And it's something like 20 million atoms, and you sort of go, I can't believe that 20 million atoms. And I've been thinking atoms are kind of like because of all the diagrams, they always seem so solid and bulbous, you know, like these round balls, and they give this designer some, like, do a visualization of an atom, and we've all seen them, and they've been around for years, and they never change. They're always a thing orbiting a planet, you know. So old Newtonian ideas, and they're all, and so I think, you know, like, so these are things that come up, but the research is very much, I read papers. Well, I don't, sometimes I lie about that. I don't read the papers. I usually just cut and paste them into the audio so I do text to audio, and then I just listen to them because it's so much easier to comprehend for me than trying to. So most of my research is full of PDFs of people talking about science, or talking about philosophy, or talking about things. And then these links start to appear, you know, between various things, like, you know, like the Kandinsky doing his first abstract watercolor, and Niels Bohr's trying to imagine what happens inside an atom. So he's trying to visually understand what could be going on in the mechanics inside and you know, they're both around the same time, you know, and I start to think, what would the world be like if Kandinsky's abstract painting was an actual visualization of the inside of the atom? Would we have a different world, you know, rather than this sort of mechanical process of these balls aren't balls that are spinning but aren't spinning? So so that gives us a false idea of things. Anyway, so then to try and get the quantum work done, I had to go and see the quantum computing people and start to try and see if they would let me have access to some of their ideas and thinking, and also enable me to propose a kind of research. So one of the things I proposed was that I wanted to, because they use a microwave signal to affect the spin, there isn't a spin, of an electron, then I wanted to see if I could, rather than have just that process that they use, it's just a microwave at this rate or that rate, that I could actually affect the microwave signal, so to give it some contextualized meaning. And so I asked if I could read to it Feynman's paper on the birth of a quantum computer. So he's saying, if you want to make a computer, then you have to make it quantum, you know, and it's a beautiful concept type of thing. And so you try and do this. So then I read to this, and the technician would then take that reading and convert it to a different wave format that became a microwave format. I mean, still in the sort of wave, but obviously not. So you're dealing with something that's indexical to what you're saying. But I thought, you know, it's like, you know, a father talking to the son, you know, this is what I've created, you know, this is you. And so it became a process of waiting and waiting and waiting for them to be able to do the experiment, you know. So it's not like I'm, you know, in the lab, you know, with the thing, because that investment in time is just not possible for me to learn those skills, or to learn how to operate an atomic force microscope in the conditions that it needs to be in. But just to know that, let's say with the atomic force microscope, that what you're looking at is where the cantilever, which is a tiny little point, comes down and touches the surface, and then pulls back. Because it's attracted to the surface, it has to have energy to pull back, and that energy is what they measure. So they get the image from the energy that it takes to pull away from the surface. And these are all different ways of thinking about the image and how we see the world and so on. And seeing it through touch becomes a fascinating, you know, construct. So all the time, what I'm trying to get around to is that my research is often, and then I'll take the data and talk to a colleague who can help manipulate the data and discuss. And so I see that as being the collaboration. I'm not necessarily collaborating with scientists, I'm asking them to do things that that I'm interested in seeing, and then working with a technology person who's often an artist as well, but to say, but who can write code and who can, give me the chance to find ways to visually express this, and then coming up with a kind of that relationship. So it's really being instrumental in having an idea and then finding the technology to be able to put it into practice, and finding the skills of the other people to make the work, and to maintain. So it's like I wrote a book called Quantum Art and Uncertainty, and one of the things I learned when I was trying to write this was that I really needed to try and make an analog artwork where I wasn't using technology to express, to see if I could express the emotion and so on that I was feeling in a work, because I felt that it'd be unauthentic unless I did that. So I don't know if that really answers, but it sort of gives you an idea that I skirt and I try to, but it took me a year to get them to agree to do the voice. So I need to get things done now. I'm not good at waiting, so I push, and sometimes they happen and sometimes they don't. But that's all you can really do is take your direction, what you want. I'm not interested in illustrating scientific things. I'm interested in making an artwork that expresses something. And you try and give a gift, but gifts are awkward things. Like if you gave me a gift now and I have to fly back to Australia, I would maybe say, well, maybe I'll bin that gift because I can't carry it and it's excess baggage. And so sometimes the gifts can become a curse, like what happened with the Midas. Yeah.